All right, hey y'all, welcome back. Okay, we're going to continue Rousseau. We're again in book two, chapter 8, The People. Didn't really have any notes for that chapter, so we're going to move to chapter 9, The People Continued. So basically, Rousseau claims that there is a natural curve related between the size and the stability of a state. Too small, excuse me, too large and things get unwieldy and you can't really keep the contract upheld because there's too many groups, too many ideas of what the general good is. Too small and your state can't defend itself. So you got to find some sort of happy medium, right? And he says if your state is too large, there are a couple problems. The first is that the distance literally just makes administration difficult, right? And we kind of know this. Like the further out you get from the capital, or the more rural you get, the less attention you get, the less administration there is. And second, the distance makes people's admiration for politicians worse, and we know this for a fact by statistical and research data that sort of the further you get from say like city district representative to mayor to state rep to federal rep, the less admiration and respect and trust people have in those leaders the farther up the line they get. They think they're untouchable. They think they're elites. They think they're not like us, and they're so far. How could they know anything about us, right? Um, okay. And so Rousseau says that there is a happy medium, and to try to err on the side of small rather than large. And he says, quote, "It may be said that the reason for expansion, being merely external and relative, ought to be subordinate to the reasons for contraction, which are internal and absolute. A strong and healthy constitution is the first thing to look for, and it is better to count on the vigor which comes of good government than on the resources a great territory furnishes." So don't worry as much about expansion and colonialism and all of the rest. That's what got Rome in trouble, right? This hyper expansionism can collapse before your eyes, and so that's what we saw with the Roman Empire. That's arguably what we saw with the Soviet Empire when they collapsed in 1989 and 1991 era, and all of their satellite states broke off. So it's a concern getting too large. I think he's got a bit of a point. Okay, chapter 10, The People Continued. He also says there's a sweet spot for the number of citizens you have and the size of the territory, right? And he gives an interesting discussion of sort of the confluence of emergencies and the rise of tyrants, which we actually see again statistically from a research perspective. When you have emergencies like war, civil war, famine, sedition, disease, we see tyrants rise. And he says, quote, "Not that many governments have not been set up during such storms, but in such cases these governments are themselves the state's destroyers. Usurpers always bring about or select troublous times to get past, under cover of public terror, destructive laws which the people would never adopt in cold blood. The moment chosen is one of the surest means of distinguishing the work of the legislator from that of the tyrant. So be careful of a leader during troubling times, right?" And there are a lot of people that sort of like criticized the Bush administration after 9/11, right? Because they passed the Patriot Act. We found out about all of this domestic surveillance where they're tapping phone calls, they're tracking who you're calling, all of these sorts of things. And we thought all of that was external as the American people. Like we thought they were doing that to foreign nationals, but then it was released through some arguably illegal means that the U.S. government was actually tapping U.S. citizen phones and stuff. So the U.S. Patriot Act made a lot of people very nervous. The idea that we're giving up freedom for security, right? And those who argue for security, in Rousseau's mind at least, are most likely to be tyrants. Okay, chapter 11, The Various Systems of Legislation. Rousseau claims basically that legislation has two functions, liberty and equality, right? And he focuses on equality. He says, quote, equality we should understand not that the degrees of power and riches are to be absolutely identical for everybody. So he's not saying, I'm not calling for a communist utopia, right? Like not everybody's going to have the exact same things, of course. He goes on and says, but that power shall never be great enough for violence and shall always be exercised by virtue of rank and law. And that, in respect of riches, no citizen shall ever be wealthy enough to buy another, and none poor enough to be forced to sell himself, which implies, on the part of the great, moderation in goods and position, and on the side of the common sort, moderation in avarice and covetousness. It is precisely because the force of circumstances tends continually to destroy equality that the force of legislation should always tend to its maintenance. So he's calling here for I'm not going to say like a communist utopia, but he is saying there are limits to sort of the greed that should exist in society and the poverty that should exist in society. And so I think he would point more toward like the Finnish or the Swedish or the Danish model than to the sort of rapaciousness of the U.S. model and the extraordinary greed and the extraordinary poverty that we see in this country that doesn't quite exist in a lot of European developed nations, right? We don't see nearly this level of inequality in our society. And he's saying here, be very careful of inequality because that's when people start getting very angry. Rousseau also sort of touches on comparative advantage nearly 3 years before it's rationally formulated by economists, which I found very interesting. So economists in the 70s especially were pushing this idea of comparative advantage, right? Focus on what you're good at, export it, and import the things that someone else is good at, and it'll be better for everyone, right? Um, and so he says, quote, if, for instance, the soil is barren and unproductive or the land too crowded for its inhabitants, the people should turn to industry and crafts, right? Industrialization. And exchange what they produce for the commodities they lack, right? So if you don't have land and agrarian land, you should focus on industrialization and trade it for agrarian goods. If, on the other hand, a people dwells in rich plains and fertile slopes, or in a good land lacks inhabitants, it should give all its attention to agriculture, which causes men to multiply and should drive out the crafts, which would only result in depopulation by grouping in a few localities the few inhabitants there are. So he's saying, if you are a widespread agricultural land, you should focus on that and not try to urbanize and industrialize because that's just going to leave a lot of your land fallow because your citizens are going to leave the rural areas. So kind of an interesting discussion there. Okay, that's it for book 2. We're going to skip chapter 12 and then we'll just dive into book 3, which starts with a discussion of governments. All right, thanks for being here. Have a great day.